Okay, and our next step here, today's webinar is going to be presented by Jana Valakovic. She's the County Director and Forest Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. She is a registered professional forester and forest scientist whose skills and interests cover a wide set of natural resource fields. And let me make sure that, there we go, there's the screen. Thanks, Jana.
Thank you, Stacy. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and it's wonderful to be able to share some information with such a great and diverse audience. I just want to check my audio. Does it sound okay?
You sound just great. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I'm going to, through the webinar format, hopefully be able to share some lessons that have been learned from this last year's fire season and provide some overall guidance to both the home design, construction, and maintenance side for fire hardness, as well as the near home vegetation and how to manage that so that you don't end up in a situation like you can see in this photo from Coffey Park, which is from the western side of Santa Rosa and kind of the urban core where the Tubbs fire burned into that community very tragically. So talk a bit about how homes burn from wildfire, then explore a bit about the vegetation and landscaping, and then spend the bulk of the time talking about the vulnerabilities in home design and what, through research, we've been able to really suss out as sort of the key points and what we can all do to better allow our homes to withstand a future wildfire exposure. For this work, I worked with Dr. Steve Quarles. He was our UC fire durability expert. He's now retired, and he's taken a gig with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is an amazing organization that has a full research arm. And so you'll see some slides that come from a laboratory where Steve is able to build and design buildings and then be able to show simulated exposures to different types of wildfire. And then through some very careful placement of cameras, we can begin to understand kind of how the parts begin to unfold and how a house can actually burn. So we can kind of detangle some of the mess that is difficult to interpret when you weren't at the home when it actually is exposed. So this work is a representation of many years of work, more than 15 years or more, and some other colleagues throughout the United States. So when we think about what happened in the 2017 fire season, it's filled with great tragedy, significant acres of wildfire burned, and some rather shocking and stunning events. We probably had more exposure in the media to wildfire this year than probably any previous year throughout California and really throughout the nation in a long time. And so grabbing that public attention, I think it's a good opportunity to think about where our vulnerabilities are and what type of exposures we experience. I'm going to talk a bit about this year's fire season, but mostly I'm going to spend time focusing on the houses and the home loss and what we can do to address that issue. The lessons that were learned in these sets of fires around the greater Santa Rosa or North Wine Country area are certainly applicable throughout much of the region, including the Thomas Fire and other fires that happened in the Sierra foothills. The main common theme that happens between the series of different fires in California was this significant wind event, which is termed a Diablo wind event, which comes from the east to the west, and it followed a vegetation that was primed to burn, but most significantly is it was of extreme high velocity, and it was sustained for long time periods, enough that now we understand that through some of the CAL FIRE investigations that we're able to trigger the failure of power lines or the failure of trees into power lines, which started many ignitions. I think the hardest lesson to learn in these North Bay sets of fires is that the ignitions happen largely at night, in a time period where people couldn't see the smoke, maybe were too asleep to smell the smoke, and so it really challenged the entire infrastructure we have to respond. And my great appreciation goes out to all of those first responders who were, tasked with the difficult challenge of trying to notify people, trying to coordinate among multiple events. And really, it was just a collision of one event after another, fully exhausting the emergency response system and the ability to really respond. So there's a lot that is in this. I'm just going to really keep it at that kind of broad brush overview, and suggest that I think we get complacent in thinking that if we're going to be experiencing a wildfire, it's going to happen in the daytime. And this, these lessons really suggested it happened at night. And so there was very little time for people to prepare, which means that when you think about future exposures of your home, what can your home do on its own to survive? How have you set up your home or your buildings, whatever they may be, or your businesses to be able to withstand fire exposure? So let's go into thinking a little bit about the types of fire exposures that a building might experience. One of the pieces that got me particularly interested in visiting, I work in Eureka, so I'm in the very northern part of California. I got very interested in visiting some of these fires as soon as I could get in, because I was seeing drone-based images that were being released via the media of residential areas in and around Santa Rosa and Sonoma, where you could see that the vegetation didn't burn, but the homes were consumed. And so I was really interested in trying to understand what that meant in a more wildland or an area where there was greater separation between homes. And so what I'm going to show you is one drone video I was able to take on day 19 after the fires ignited in October. And I think this video gives some interesting illustration to some of the challenges. So this was taken between Calistoga and Santa Rosa. It's in an area with low population density. And you can see my cursor here. This is a home right here. This is a truck, which has got a lot of heat damage on it, a lot of radiant heat damage. And this was a garage kind of shop area. And so this is just a little 10-second video. But what I want to illustrate is that you can see that there was a large amount of defensible space around this home. It was really in a kind of a pasture environment. There was active cattle grazing around the house. You can see that there's a fence line. So even with that defensible space, what prompted this home and that building to be lost and not the surrounding vegetation? So it wasn't a wall of flames that came up to that house and exposed that house. In essence, these homes burned in some ways from the inside out, from, unfortunately, the facilitation of small bits of burning material, often called embers, getting lodged either in or adjacent to the homes, and those homes catching on fire. So as I conclude in this image, you can see that where the vegetation burned, it was where it had heat exposure from the buildings themselves, not necessarily from a wildland fire that moved through the area. Okay, let's see if I can. So let's talk a little bit about stages of wildfire and what kind of home exposure we might see. So on the top left, you can see a time scale of attack, and here you can see the embers that are being lofted at the building here. And this is about a half an hour prior to perhaps a wave of flames coming through, or it can be a longer time period depending on how far the embers are traveling. Then there can be the actual direct flame contact, which can be rather short-lived. But then there's a much longer period, as is shown on the bottom left, where once there were small bits of fire ignited, that those continue to burn and may burn the surrounding vegetation, may burn the building, and this process can last for a fairly long time, especially if you're not there or there's no fire professionals available to be able to extinguish any of those small fires that are around the home. So looking at that in a more nuanced way, let's look at kind of the exposures that you might see. So I showed you the Ember concept, where small bits of material are blasted at the house. So here's this laboratory I was talking about at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and you can see the red being these simulated embers being pushed with high degree of velocity behind them at this building, and we can start to look at where they tend to accumulate. So this is kind of the Ember firebrand form of exposure, which is how the majority of homes in buildings in the Sonoma sets of fires really were lost. There also can be the direct flame contact. Here that's shown on the right with a broom and the gutters ignited. And the third way that a home can be lost is through radiant heat. When an adjacent building or outbuilding is under full combustion, and the amount of just heat that comes off of that building may cause combustion in the surrounding buildings. So let's drill into each of these and think about what kind of ways that we can either design, retrofit, or maintain a building so it can withstand all three types of exposures. So embers are really where the majority of my program is going to focus, because they're responsible for the majority of building ignitions. And here's an illustration with the Angora fire in South Lake Tahoe, where you can see that the vegetation did not ignite, but it was the home itself. So this has been a story that's been around for a long time, but I think one that's a bit harder for us to prepare for because it's not necessarily the way we think about fire socially in the United States. Here's another illustration of that same concept. This is in Fountain Grove, which is on the hillsides overlooking Santa Rosa. It's part of Santa Rosa City itself, but you can see the white and gray components are house after house after house that were combusted. But again, the vegetation in most cases is relatively green and lush and had little engagement. In this case, there was embers that came from the wildland side of the fire that then eventually caught homes on fire, and then there was an additional layer of construction embers that were generated. So as those houses were burning, they were also contributing materials that were able to extend ember contact from one building to the next or over long distances, especially with those winds that were in the 50 and 60 mile an hour range. There were illustrations in Santa Rosa, for example, and many reported stories of embers, the sizes of 2x4s, large pieces of material, burning blocks that were lofted and landed on other buildings. So there is a relationship between both the wildland contribution of material that can be in that ember generated, as well as the home construction piece, and one kind of can feed to the next in a rather domino sequence. So let's talk about the basics of fire. So fire is the product of fuel, oxygen, and heat. So if you don't give any air, there's no way it can burn, for example. If you don't have anything to burn, it doesn't matter if you have oxygen and heat, you're not going to have fire. But the fire behavior is driven by a variety of characteristics. If there is fuel, what kind of fuel is it? What are the weather conditions? Is it windy? Is it dry? And then where on the slope? What is the topography of the area, and how does that topography affect fire behavior? So as humans, we can't really adjust the slope or topography. We can't really affect the weather in any significant way. What of those two important fire triangles can we influence? Clearly, that's fuel. That's the part that we have some control over. And so what I'd like to do is, fuel is something that we think about largely, I think, from a vegetation perspective. So it's dead or dying vegetation. But fuel can be also wood siding. It can be roofing. It can be fencing. It can be landscape mulch. It can be a pile of newspapers. It can be lawn furniture. It can be any number of items that are adjacent and around our homes that are combustible, more than just trees and woody shrubs or the surrounding vegetation. It's all of those things together. And so when it comes to thinking about those North Bay fires, when they started at night, what was around and vulnerable to those homes? What of that fuel material created some additional vulnerabilities? Knowing that it was a red flag warning day, knowing that we were experiencing extreme winds, I guess what I'm trying to do is teach people to look for the signs and signals, just like we do in earthquakes and tsunamis. We learn to read the signs of an earthquake, know the time and duration to know whether or not a tsunami will be triggered. Well, the same can be said for those red flag warnings and the potential vulnerabilities that they may create. So what can we do to help us be better prepared? So now I'm going to move into that component of managing the fuel and the vegetation and the landscaping. So what is different about the presentation I'm going to give today than other people's work is that we're really trying to shift the dispensable space framework from working from the house outward. Much of our communication materials, depending on which agency you're coming from, really focus on working from the outside in, thinking about that zone of 100 feet to the property, to the home. What I'd like to do is really reorient and have people think about what is immediately adjacent to your home. So using this visual, here's the home. What's in that 0 to 5 foot zone? From there, what's the kind of lean and green zone, this 15 to 20 or 30 feet kind of donut surrounding the building, and then this more reduced fuel zone that's outside of those two nested circles. It does not need to be free of vegetation completely. It can have privacy, but the composition and configuration and placement all have different qualities that influence the survivability of our home. And what I saw in these North Bay fires is that there was very little attention placed right adjacent to that area, right around the home. And we tend to over-vegetate in that zone, and we tend to we collect a lot of things in that zone, and that is what likely contributed in part to the large number of homes that were lost in these fires. So what we're in the University of California and in the Insurance Business Institute for Home Safety trying to advocate is for a non-combustible zone immediately adjacent to the house in a 5-foot diameter outside, so that can reduce the chance of flame contact and exposure, and it also can reduce the chance that vegetation will be ignited through ember exposures. We've done a good job in California in giving a visual aesthetic impression that the home needs to be anchored by vegetation around it. And so what we're trying to suggest is there's a ways visually to provide that aesthetic pleasing quality, but give your home some separation, and a way to sort of shift the movement of our plantings. And one thing to consider is that it needs to be present on all sides of the home. So if you leave one side of the home heavily vegetated, then it's very likely that is where the exposures are going to happen. So there's some ways to do that, and we're working with our UC Master Gardeners to help people start to get a handle on what that might look like so that they can still have those aesthetic pleasing qualities. And still provide that vegetation, that protection from vegetation at the same size. So if you look at these images, what we're trying to say is these big bushy materials that are right smack dab next to the house, can you replace that with something that's low growing? Maybe it's lawn, maybe it's crushed rock, maybe it's pavers, maybe it's some succulents, maybe it's something different that is not likely to burn and produce much significant heat. Then outside, so if you can see my cursor here in the lawn, maybe this is where the planter boxes go and some of the additional vegetation goes that gives that visual pleasing quality. So the goal is really to separate that vegetation from the house as much as possible. One thing to keep in mind, and you will see lots of people try and market an idea of a fire-resistant plant list. And here's an illustration. Here's from the Tubbs fire, where this is cactus, and you can see that the cactus at least got a lot of heat exposure and was not very happy there. But all plants can burn regardless of how they're marketed. And I think the challenge for people to recognize is that just because you bought something with a label on it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't require maintenance. It doesn't require pruning or irrigation or deadheading the flowers or whatever it takes to reduce some of that overall abundance of senescing vegetation through time. And as you're thinking about it, like on the left here, you can see something that is low growing. It has a real high moisture content. This is less likely to burn than a juniper, for example. Many native and drought tolerant plants can be options, but they also need to be maintained well. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is think about plants and their structures and how to maintain them more than whether they're thought by someone else to be fire resistant. And at the same time, also think about what we do to try and preserve moisture. Mulches are, super important in our capacity to hold moisture in the ground and reduce our overall water demands. But mulches can burn too, and if embers are landing on mulches that are right adjacent to your house, then you may be creating more vulnerability than you realize. So hardscape, rock mulch, lawns, all within that 0 to 5 foot zone. So again, here's some more images of mulches and how they burned in the Tubbs fire. And here's some just illustrations of some research test plots where you can see that it's certainly easy to ignite these kinds of different mulches. So there's trade-offs. Clearly, we're talking about trade-offs, but how can you make more strategic decisions in the design and maintenance of your home? That's what we're trying to get at. So let's scale into the home itself. We're going to look at some both laboratory simulated pictures as well as actual pictures to show you, some of these vulnerabilities. So again, this is ember exposure on a house. This house has got cameras all over it, and so we'll be able to see kind of how it withstands this ember exposure. So the number one priority, if you come home with any take-home messages, is really to focus on the roof. And we're going to talk about the vulnerabilities that roofs have in multiple locations, both at the top of the roof, at the drip edge and the gutter line, the bottom of the roof, the overall surface covering of the roof, the skylights themselves, as well as any more complex roofs, as illustrated by these dormers, where you've got potentially combustible siding on that roof surface that creates a weakness and a location where leaves and other materials can accumulate. So roof edges. They can often be filled with or have gaps that create places where embers can lodge and can get inside. So here's this terracotta tile roof on the right-hand side. These are called bird stops, and they are typically filled. And so you can see if you had an ember exposure and you didn't have your bird stops filled, that despite having this nice, very fire-resistant covering, you unfortunately have a gap there and a place for fire to get in. Again, here's another illustration of a tile roof, and you can see the gap that's exposed there. So it's important to look at the roof you have and make sure you don't have these types of gaps, and then think about filling them appropriately. There's also the concept of making sure you have a metal drip edge that covers over the final element of the roof as it connects with the gutter, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more. And also to think about the long-term maintenance and what type of accumulation of materials your roof is exposed to. So here you can see that you've got a more complex roof on the upper left. You've got combustible siding, and you have a place where litter material accumulates both on the roof surface as well as right in that transition to the combustible siding. So that's a great weakness within this roof. And here you can see under the ember exposure that it's pretty darn easy to catch that material on fire. And then you've got a wall that is essentially the only defense against the fire getting into the attic or into the building itself. So places that things can be changed. This wall, for example, can be better hardened on the dormer. There are other ways to think about this, as well as maintenance to try and keep that litter material from either being lopped or being dropped there, or being able to making sure you have the capacity to help remove that material. Gutters are super important, but they are also points of weakness. You want a gutter because you want to keep the rain from sheeting off the roof and landing on the wall surface and having more exposure on the walls than necessary, which can create places where you can get a leak and you can have rot. If you live in a Mediterranean climate, a gutter is really important, but gutters need to be maintained. Here on the left, you can see this metal gutter with lots of pine needles that are accumulated in it, even a little seedling growing out of it. Embers land on the roof. They land in the gutter. They ignite. Here's some illustrations of both a plastic gutter and a metal gutter. They will ignite that material, and if you don't have a metal drip edge, that little cap, as we were talking about earlier, the amount of flame here can be sufficient to get underneath the roof covering and get into the attic. The plastic gutters are interesting because they melt and they often fall away. Then they'll bring some exposures to the siding. I prefer a metal gutter personally, but it's just interesting to think about what kind of material your home is built of and how it may withstand, a heat exposure or flame contact. Skylights, I think, are relatively straightforward. Here's a set of pictures from a redwood forest, a very dark place to live. I would need skylights if I was living in that forest area, just for a little bit of sun sanity. But you can see the great quantity of material that is dropped from that overhanging vegetation. And the skylights themselves are certainly much more vulnerable than a Class A roof is. And so, this roof is in great need of maintenance. And there are differences between these flat-shaped skylights as well as these more beveled skylights, which tend to shed the leaf litter. Regardless, there's too much material left on this house, and those skylights become a place of vulnerability and potential penetration. So the second take-home point is really thinking about venting. Vents are really important. I think about them a lot like having Gore-Tex as rain gear or something you might take to the snow, where the vents help you, as you get hot and exercise, let that moisture out. But they need to be designed such that they don't let embers in. So your home would rot from the inside if it didn't have an ability to release the moisture that's collected through cooking or maybe through your heating system if you heat with natural gas and the venting doesn't work perfectly. So you need a system that is allowing both a whole circulation system that allows an inflow and exflow of air. So there are under eave vents, which are important to be able to let that inflow come in, and then the gable end vents here, where my cursor is at the triangle point on the roof, lets the exflow go out, or through the through roof vents in the top. There's also foundation vents, there's dryer vents. So there's a lot of new changes in technology that are helping us build and better design venting systems. So they're more like Gore-Tex, so they can both resist embers coming in as well as resist flame exposure, but then still allow that outflow of moisture. So just to illustrate why we're going to talk about vents, here is from those homes, that building in the laboratory, the Insurance Institute lab, where you can see these little sparks coming through. So these are cameras that are on as those embers are being lodged at the house. And so here on the gable end vent, you can see the amount of embers coming in. Here are some eave-based vents. And so if you have ember exposure and those embers are able to penetrate your vents, what do these embers land on? What is stored in your attic that they are potentially able to ignite? I have a little too much stuff stored in my attic. I need to remove some of that stuff. Much of it is in paper product form. For example, my children's artwork that I'm still hanging on to for whatever reason. But through ember exposure, it can be very easy because paper products don't take much heat to create ignition. So what does it take to for those embers to come in? So how can we better design a venting system that creates the kind of moisture outflow that we need, but is resistant to the penetration by embers or by flames themselves? And so what has changed is really a focus on the venting size, the screen size. So here on the left is an illustration of a 1/4-inch mesh. And what we're recommending is that you move to an 1/8-inch mesh screening. One of the trade-offs with smaller screening is it's easy to, when painting, especially if spraying your house, it's easy to fill that venting, that screen space with a bunch of paint, and then the vent no longer works. But if you understand the importance of those vents, a little more attention and focus on them, I think we'll be able to get by with the 1/8-inch screen or smaller. So this is the cheap way to change a vent. There are some new technologies that meet California's Chapter 7A, which is the guidance around building in a wildland-urban interface, that have some new technologies in them. So the top left, number A here, is a foundation vent, and it's treated with an intumescent covering, and it's kind of a honeycomb design. And so with heat exposure, that intumescent covering gets warm and melts and will clog up the vent. So it's only a one-time use in this case, but it will it'll both prevent flame penetration as well as ember penetration. Number B here on the lower left is a through roof vent, and it's has steel wool in it, and so it's got another system that is created to resist those embers. Number C is a gable end vent with a baffle design, all metal construction, and it is also meets Chapter 7A standards. And then number D is also a gable end vent, but it's got an intumescent treatment on it, an intumescent way to handle that heat exposure. So these are not widely available, but I'm encouraging people to take the vent challenge this year and at least try and adjust their vents if possible. In terms of cost, number D, this larger gable end vent, is the $125 range, and these other ones are in the $25 to $30 range. But you'll want to, ask your building supply station to make sure that they've got the right kind of vents, or your contractor to make sure that they're getting this new standard of these either Vulcan vents, and there's a variety of other contractors or construction groups that are making these. So at the end, I'll go through where you can find out more about those suppliers. Ridge vents are also another group that are vulnerable to debris. So they're designed at the cap of the roof, and they have a system that lets air out. Just think about, especially in this case, we've got this example where there's a low pitch roof, what can accumulate next to them? And so if you've got vegetation that accumulates next to them, and that, like in this debris here, that can create a place for fire, which then can get easily into the home. So a ridge line vent system is a good system to go with overall, but you need to make sure that it can handle and withstand wind-driven events. So that's a rating to look at on the ridge vent system that you might have or might be thinking about installing. So let's move on to exterior walls. There's a lot to talk about, and I'm not going to talk about every element of the home given the amount of time we have. But what I really want to think about is that non-combustible zone, both in a vertical and horizontal framework. So if you look at the image on the left where you've got combustible mulches, you've got combustible, wood siding, that's all, there's almost no breathing room between the house and all of that vegetation. Lots of vulnerability. So what we're really trying to push for is, if you see in the lower right-hand side, is both a horizontal and a vertical non-combustible zone. So you've got more separation from any potential set of embers or flame contact. So this is the overall mode that we're focused on. There's a lot more to say about walls, but the number 1 and 2 priorities are the roof and the venting systems over the walls themselves. Then there's some obvious pieces to think about, and that's, again, what are the fuels that are left outside your house, like your wooden broom, for example, with a nice straw broom, whatever those are called, and that left outside pretty easily ignited, or material left underneath a deck, or gaps and joints. So, for example, here's a wall unit, and you can see this big gap, and you've got leaf material right next to it. That's a way for embers to get inside. There were many stories in Santa Rosa about how people could see the embers blowing into the garages because the garage door, there was just a nice little gap there. It didn't come and close all the way down. So just thinking about those places where if you see leaf material accumulating where it shouldn't be, that's exactly where the embers are likely to accumulate. They'll land in those same air currents, those same eddies that the leaves land in. I don't know why it's so easy for us as humans to want to store things under our decks, but it creates a significant vulnerability. Often we store woody materials. They're of overall smaller diameters, so easier to ignite. And so, a fire can easily get ignited underneath the deck, then the deck gets engaged, and then the amount of heat coming off the deck can create vulnerabilities to the house. So switching that to an environment where you've got a non-combustible set of materials under the deck is the way to go. I'd like to talk a little bit about fences. I think we don't often think about them. I'm certainly a proponent of wood, but because fences are made of small diameter materials, they're relatively easy to catch on fire. They're often near dry vegetation, so the vegetation catches on fire. That connects to the fence catches on fire, and then the fence brings the fire to the house. And here's an illustration. This was taken on the night that the Tubbs fire ignited, and this is in the Coffee Park area in an urban area, and you can see that the fence is fully engaged, and it has brought the fire to this house. As well, the gutter has been engaged as well. So pretty easy for those fences to get ignited and become the way that the fire is brought to the house. So a way to keep your beautiful wood fence is just to install a metal gate right at that point of connection to the house, which can help basically break that transition to the house. And as I wrap up here, I just want to illustrate that as much work as you do, you're going to want to work as a community, because your neighbor's house could be in that area, could be very close to you, and its condition could overwhelm the condition of your own home. So this is really a call to action to think about how we can better look and analyze at our houses, and how we can work together to try and fix some of the challenges that we have in both the design of the house and some of the weaknesses we have there, as well as team up to help each other with our maintenance. So in conclusion here, our overall recommendations are to focus on the roof and make sure that you install and maintain a Class A rated fire rated roof covering. And within that, you want to install a metal drip edge and address any other edge of roof vulnerabilities or penetrations that you may have through dormers or more complex roofs. We'll want to make sure that our vents are upgraded to be both flame and ember resistant. And we really want to focus on developing a non-combustible zone in the area around 5 feet around the house and under the entire footprint of the deck, and at least 6 inches vertically upward from the ground to the start of your siding. So that's where we're making the bulk of our recommendations. There's many more subtleties, and in a longer time period, we could go into more of those details. There is quite a bit of information in California's Building Code, Chapter 7A for WUI construction. This program will be available later in these live links that can connect you to the construction standards, as well as lists of suppliers that meet the construction codes are available. But what I want to say is that home design, maintenance, construction can be more important than any individual fire-resisting building product when addressing ember ignition. Poor installation and maintenance can increase the vulnerability of any given product to ember exposure. So all the parts have to work. You can't just say, I've got intumescent vents, that's all I need to do, or I have hardy plank siding, that's all I need to do. It's about all of the components and making sure that the installation has met the manufacturer's guidelines to meet the WUI construction standards and understanding how those parts work together. And good practices, think about removing those stored fuels, this debris around the house, cleaning the gutters, and thinking more clearly about what constitutes a potential fuel source in and around the house. And when it comes to the fire-safe landscape, it's more than possible to integrate both beauty, safety, privacy, and water consciousness in that landscape. But selection and placement is key, and maintenance is essential. And really, as you go home today, perhaps come to your house, think where you live, and look at what's in that immediate 0 to 5 foot zone, and what could be changed there. So for more information, we have lots of printed materials. Here are 3 illustrations. There's a guide that we've written that's free and downloadable on home landscaping for fire. There's a much more in-depth guide on home survival in wildfire-prone areas, both the building materials design and maintenance considerations. And there's an additional guide on combustibility of landscape mulches. And then I want to draw attention to what the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has put together. So there are some nice one-page fact sheets that will go through a variety of different components from the roof, the siding, the venting, decks, coatings, and a number of other pieces. And then there's more examples of, if you want to get into the depth of this material and learn more about the nuance, there's a larger set of materials available in that second link. So I think I'm close on time here, and I just will conclude and let you, Stacy, manage the questions that might come in with this illustration about kind of the framework of looking at the issues. I like this illustration, though I'd like to change a little bit about where the vegetation is placed. But the idea is maintain a roof, replace, if you're ready to replace it, make sure it's Class A, make sure you clean those gutters, think about the placement of the vegetation, make sure you have multi-pane tempered glass windows, and take that stored firewood, take it away from the house during fire season, take some of those other materials away if you can, and really create that non-combustible zone in and around the house, and that lean and clean zone a little farther from that, and then the reduced fuel zone overall. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful job. Thank you so much, Yana. A lot of great information going on there. And we do have some great questions coming in as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read them and then give you a chance to answer them. And if you need to clarify your question, you just submit another question to me. So the first one starts with the statement, I feel like thinning and vegetation management is easy, or it meets the agency targets like acres treated, mitigated. So what are some of the ideas or strategies to change the performance measures from acres treated to homes hardened?
That's a great question. I think it takes a community. I mean, I think if what I said today resonates with that person who asked that question, I think a better understanding of how we lose our homes is important. And, I don't know. I've been thinking about it from a policy level towards, could there be some kind of insurance discount? And I don't really want to open the insurance discussion, but some kind of performance measure standard that could be incentivized. There's a lot of nuance to this, and there's a lot of personal responsibility to this. I think when we focus on the vegetation that's 100 feet away, we tend to lose the personal responsibility side because it becomes too big and too overwhelming. But yet, at the same time, if we can, work a little bit more from the home outward, I think it will help give people some of the tools and techniques. And then, if we work together, we can start to amplify those sets of tasks, responsibilities, and accomplishments.
Excellent. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge for the future. So the next one, you did have a couple of resources already listed, but I'll go ahead and read this and see if there's additionals. So the question is, for landowners in the North Bay, what consumer-friendly graphics or guidelines can be cited to argue for focusing on areas closer to homes so that people don't keep focusing on clearing vegetation over hundreds of feet away? Any other resources that you can think of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are working to update some of our materials, and those should be available in the next couple of months, I hope. But I think I'm thinking on my feet here. I'm trying to think of what's in every single one of those guides as to whether or not it has all of those pieces in there. How about this? I'll do some review and try and make sure I add that into a slide and post it with this set of materials that will be posted online.
That's a great time to mention too. So after this webinar, once the recording is up and we'll have the PDF of the slides, any other resources I can think of too, I'll send in that email with direct links. So whether it's in the slides, Yana, or whether we put it as a link within the email, we'll send it out to everybody within a week or so. Okay, great. Next question. Could you talk a little bit more about mulch, depth of mulch, kind of mulch, and some of the trade-offs with soil health and water use efficiency versus vulnerability to fire? So just kind of a lot more on the mulch side of things.
Right. So mulch is a great point. As I said, there are trade-offs here. Well, I guess the main point I'm trying to illustrate is you want mulch for building soil health. You want more mulch for maintaining water content. You want mulch so that you're capable of reducing your overall water needs. But when it's really in that 5-foot non-combustible zone that we're talking about adjacent to the home, that's probably not the place for combustible mulches to be. So consider a rock mulch, consider use of pavers, consider maybe there's a little lawn that goes there, maybe it's just really heavily weed whipped, dry vegetation that you get down to the nubs. So it's about placement. So, mulch is important, but I wouldn't be mulching right next to your house if you have the potential for an ember exposure in the future.
Great. And another question kind of specific on that is, how tall is too tall with well-maintained vegetation that has high moisture content within that 5 feet of the house?
I think it's all too tall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Without knowing what the specific plant is or how it all fits together, the other next question is that plant adjacent to non-combustible siding? Is there a vent above it? What is the overall context for that vegetation? In general, we're really trying to say, pull some of that material back away from your house if you can. I know that we've got prized plants, but these are just some of the trade-offs that we have to make and figure out how we're going to mitigate the potential vulnerabilities of leaving a prized piece of vegetation in a place that maybe it shouldn't be from fire.
Great. So moving on to some more ecological side of questions. This question is about redwood forests and how vulnerable are people in redwood forests versus other environments nearby?
Well, redwood certainly has clear evidence that fire burns periodically. You can't get goose pens or some of the basal hollows. So those fire scars create openings through time, and some are described as goose pens. That's a folkloric term for the idea that the settlers would store their geese in them and actually put a little barricade over them for the night so they were protected. All of those illustrate that there's been a regular occurrence of fire in the redwood zone. I think it depends on what part of the redwood zone you're in. In Monterey County, the redwood zone's seen a lot of fire. In Humboldt County, the redwood zone hasn't seen very much fire, but we have in the last decade. But we have lots of evidence of fire. The problem I have with living in redwoods is how much material comes down. The other problem I have with redwoods is that generally in the redwood zone, when we're in a condition dry enough to burn, so is the rest of the state. So this is an issue we face here in the northern part of the state, is that when we're in that condition and likely to be able to burn, resources are deployed elsewhere, and we don't have any resources. In our own particular story in Humboldt County, we had a fire that started on October, one of the Tubbs fires started the 8th or the 9th, the same day. Ours started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, also from a power line coming down. We still had crews here, and they were able to manage it, where the next set of fires didn't start for 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Had our fire started later in the evening, I don't know what resources we would have had left here, and whether we would have had enough to be able to get on that fire. So it's understanding the complexity of layering of both emergency response, the frequency of fire, the amount of material that is in and around our homes. All these parts kind of layer together. So I think I need a little bit more to know the context of the particular house or built environment. But to me, there are great risks, and there's lots of evidence of fire in redwoods.
Which I know when I first heard about that, it surprised me as well, just because you think of redwoods, you think of so much moisture and that sort of thing. But when you're walking around, you really can see, there's a lot of fuel, and you can see from the fire history that, they do burn. So great clarification for that. Our next question is it a requirement to bring homes up to the California Building Code for Chapter 7A WUI standards? I think that's in reference to homes that are previously built.
So the requirement for changing to Chapter 7A is usually triggered, to the 7A standards, is triggered upon a remodel. There can be individual zoned ordinances within counties or cities that may trigger that differently. So there's some discretion that jurisdictions have over when they create that standard. What I'm just trying to do is share the information, share some of the products that meet the standards for that, and really think about how your home or building that you're worried about could experience future fire exposure, and what can you do to make changes. Now, and many of those are just in maintenance side alone and don't require major construction changes. Or when it comes time to replace your roof, to really think more clearly about the product you use when you do that, and the installation of it, to make sure that you get the best product and the best longevity and durability in that roof from exposures from moisture and storms in the winter all through the heat of the summer and fire.
And a follow-up from the same person, do you know if there's any financial assistance options or incentives that are offered by insurance companies for updating your home as far as fire codes?
I am not familiar with any, but there may be, and maybe someone in the chat box could put in a comment if they are aware of some. I think it's a good question, and one I think from a policy level that we need to tackle kind of community by community. There are some ideas that are emerging out of the legislature this round, but I don't know how they're going to, at the state legislative level, and I don't know how they're going to bear out this year. But there's certainly a lot of dialogue about it and a lot of interest. I think the challenge I have is that most of the focus is on new construction, but yet we have more buildings than we're going to build already in our housing stock in California. So what can we do to help promote the survival of those buildings as a focus? That's what I'm interested in.
And I will mention too, so we did do a webinar with somebody from USAA who their insurance company does offer an incentive or a discount for FireWise homes, but I think that's the only one I'm aware of. And it doesn't focus necessarily on the house as much as just being FireWise, the FireWise program. Yeah.
And so we might want to describe what FireWise is. So FireWise is, and help me, Stacey, where I get this wrong, but FireWise is a community organizing concept. There's a national program, and it's about communities working together and identifying risks, identifying opportunities, learning about fire, and just becoming more fire conscious overall. And within that, I think there's an expectation that people will start to work on their places of vulnerability, whether that's in the landscaping or the homes themselves, but it's not necessarily fully scripted in that way. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I'll just mention it's a pretty wide variety. There are some basic standards that in order to be a FireWise community, you have to have gone through, which includes like writing that community plan and that sort of thing. And I think there are some kind of bare bare minimum, but because it's a nationwide program, it's going to be different in different areas, and so it's pretty general, and a community that wants to become FireWise can take very different actions and still fit within that.
Great.
Okay, we are getting close to time, but I think we have time for a few more questions. And I want to clarify with that too. We have Nick Goulet, who mentioned that the USA offers modest discounts for homes located in recognized FireWise communities, but it's not for FireWise homes. It's for any homes that is NFPA recognized community. So it's, again, not as much of a home issue as much of a community kind of based incentive.
Thanks, Nick.
And I think also someone mentioned that State Farm has some kind of discount as well for maybe replacing roofs or some of those kind of incentives. But all right, let me see if I can grab another question here. Oh, quick question. From the very start of the presentation, you had that map of the Tubbs fire. And I was wondering, or someone was wondering, what the difference was between the hashed areas and the pink areas on that map. I think it was your first or second slide.
Yeah, I was wondering that too. I don't have a good answer for you.
I think my understanding was that it was one of the maps produced very early in October, right after the fires happened. And so there was like an area that they know the fire had for sure gone through, and then they were still calculating where exactly it had been affecting other areas. So I think I know CAL FIRE and a couple other places have maps that have the final fire perimeter, but it was pretty close to what the hashtag marks were.
Yeah.
I think at this point, Yana, I'm looking through, we've answered, if there's time, someone wanted to know how to apply these recommendations to non-WUI areas. So thinking about vegetation and mulch outside of the home areas.
In the so more like an urban area, is that your interpretation?
Either urban or maybe more park settings. I'm not quite sure. Let me see if he's still on. If you want to speak to either, go ahead.
Well, I guess it's really all the same concepts. I think what really surprised people in the Tubbs fire is that it started really in the wildland zone just outside of Calistoga. It blew up and over the Mayakama Mountains. There were homes scattered through that, and then it roared in by like 2 a.m. into the outskirts of Santa Rosa, hitting a residential area with kind of lower density in Fountain Grove, and eventually, by 4 in the morning, crossed the Highway 101, which was a 6-lane or 8-lane highway at that point, and got into what would be traditionally thought of as a core residential area and largely buffered from a wildland fire exposure. So, one of the interesting intellectual questions is, should everybody meet the WUI standards? And, I'd say no, not necessarily. I mean, really, we dealt with an extreme event and a collision of issues and crises that came together. You can't prepare for every single event. But I guess what I want to say is within that, there is a consciousness about what kind of exposures a home is likely to have, whether there'll be significant resource response, whether there'll be agency response, whether there'll be water, whether there'll be the capacity to put an engine at each home site or, within each area to be able to protect those homes. If you have any potential thought that all those systems aren't going to work, then I think these concepts apply. And give us some more ability to protect our homes individually, even if we're in more of an urban environment.
Absolutely, and I'll mention too that we were just out there on a field trip last week talking with some of the local area responders, and it was just kind of mentioned that it was an extreme event, but there are things like evacuation plans and having a go bag that you should just have, not just for fires but for all things, even if you're not in an area that is under risk or under high risk from fire. So there are some things that we can focus on that should overlap as well, but it's not necessarily meaning that everybody in a suburb should be, changing out to these WUI standards. So one last question before we take off today. Are there any statistics relevant to the North Bay region that show the relative importance of home focus versus landscape focus preparation?
Not that I'm aware of.
Same for me.
But yeah. I mean, I just want to say, whoever's left on the phone, you have asked some really challenging and great questions, and um, I talked with Stacy earlier about the thought of expanding this to a phase two where we dig in a little deeper and can spend some more time in more of the elements of the home and work through some of those nuances. So maybe we'll explore whether there's a future opportunity and whether people are interested in this. There's been a number of conferences already in California this year, but there's certainly more opportunity for more dialogue and engagement on this, and thinking through with all of our creative hats on about how we can attempt to work through some of these challenges. So I just want to thank you, and I hope I've offered some insight today that is actionable and is achievable for those of you that are thinking about these issues.
And I think that seems like a great note to end. I'll mention too that I've worked with Yana now for over 4 years, and Yana, your passion and expertise on this and trying to move us forward is always such an inspiration. So thank you so much for today and for all that you do.
Thanks, Stacy.
And I'll mention too, if you're still on, so this will be posted. I'll send an email out to everybody who is on this and registered with all these resources, the webinar, and also a evaluation survey, which really helps us in knowing who we're serving, if we're doing a good job, and what we can focus on in the future. So please take a couple minutes when you get that email to fill out the evaluation survey and check out the resources we send along.
Great. Thanks for all your hard work, Stacy.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.